Hey guys, how y'all doing? Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank you all for joining me. This is episode 139 of Hockey on the Spot. I apologize for getting this out late, but I'm here now. And for today's team, I know a lot of people are going to be very happy about this, and I'm really looking forward to this one because for today's video, we're going to be talking about the New York Rangers, and I'm really looking forward to talking about them because for their season this past year was definitely a story to tell. After a very disappointing lockout-shortened season, in which was kind of a setback year for them in a sense after being the best team in the Eastern Conference in 2011-2012, it was a setback year for them in the lockout year. They still made the playoffs, but they got eliminated in the second round by the Boston Bruins in 5 games after beating the Washington Capitals in 7 games in round number 1. But there was an early playoff exit, and a lot of questions were left on the table, and a change in the coaching staff needed to be made. Out the door went John Tortorella. In came Alain Vigneault. John Tortorella went to Vancouver, and we all know who ended up getting the better of that coaching trade. Alain Vigneault is now in his second year with the Rangers. Tortorella has been fired by the Vancouver Canucks after his first year as their head coach. But for Vigneault and the Rangers, things did not start off very well. It was one of their least active off seasons other than the coaching change. They really didn't do much to bring in anybody. They didn't bring in really any big pieces. Well, although Benoit Pouliot did end up being a big piece in the long run. But going into the year, things did not start out well for the Rangers. They began the year with a 9-game road trip in which they only won 3 games. But when you consider it's a 9-game road trip, that's actually pretty good to win 3 games. So that really wasn't the ending point of the season, obviously. That really wasn't that bad. When you consider most of that trip was out in the Western Conference playing late-night games out in Arizona and sweeping through California and St. Louis, then going to a place like Washington, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and then ending off in Detroit. Kind of a rough, 9-game road trip, and they didn't have Carl Hagelin for any of that road trip. He didn't come back until 10 games into the year. Ryan Callahan was injured at points in the year, and they didn't have Derek Stepan through training camp. They didn't get a deal done with him until the preseason was over. And even in the preseason, the Rangers were the worst team in the preseason that year. They went 1-5-0 through 6 road games in the preseason. So all in all, you consider the 9-game road trip in the regular season and the 6-game road trip in the preseason, all 6 games being on the road. We're talking about a 15-game road trip right there. And then if you even want to go farther than that, going back to Game 5 against the Boston Bruins in the playoffs, 16 straight games on the road before finally returning home to play the Montreal Canadiens and losing 2-0. But the Rangers were not doing well, and at one point in the year, they were rewarded to make up for the 9-game road trip. They were rewarded with a 9-game homestand in the month of December. A big point in the season for the Rangers to go out there and get some big points and get very high in the standings. They go on to have the most disappointing homestand in their franchise. 3-4-2 was their record during that homestand, and only one of those 3 wins came in regulation. That was against the Minnesota Wild. 2 of those wins also were the final 2 games of that homestand against Minnesota and Toronto, which actually ended up being 2 key victories. But overall, it was a horrendous road trip, and the Rangers, a horrendous homestand, and because of how horrendous that homestand was, they fell very much so in the standings. And in the beginning point of the season, Henrik Lundqvist really did not look like himself. He did not look like the king. He wasn't playing well. Even when he was finally signed to that 7-year contract extension, he wasn't playing well. He was slated to be an unrestricted free agent this year, but the Rangers signed him to that big deal. Dan Girardi was also slated to be a UFA, but he was signed to a 6-year extension just before the trade deadline. But basically, with how bad that road trip homestand was, the Rangers and their fans had pretty much given up all hope, and they were pretty much getting ready for next season already. The Rangers season was over. It truly was over. But then they made a big trade. But then the Rangers had some smiles shine on them. Believe it or not, coming in the form of an injury. Derek Dorsett goes down with an injury and is lost for 4 to 6 weeks. They're forced to go out and trade for an enforcer because with him down, he was their only player who would go out there and hit and fight and whatnot. So they go and make a huge trade. What ended up being a huge trade with the Los Angeles Kings, the team they ended up losing in the Stanley Cup Finals to, acquiring forward Dan Carcillo from the Kings in exchange for a draft pick. And a lot of people really weren't expecting much from him, but right when he came into the lineup, he brought energy to the team. Something that they didn't have, but up until his arrival. He forechecked, he hit, he fought, he did everything. He single-handedly re-energized the team around him, and he made the fourth line better too. Brian Boyle and Dominic Moore became a force to be reckoned with, and for a while, they were the best fourth line in the NHL. They went on a tear, and the game that really was and Dan Carcillo's Ranger debut on the road against the Chicago Blackhawks was probably the win of the year that changed their season around. A 3-2 win over the Chicago Blackhawks at the United Center, the then defending Stanley Cup champions. So that pretty much changed the Rangers' season around, and they got going from there. And one of the bigger moments for the Rangers last year was playing in the Stadium Series. They played 2 Stadium Series games, both at Yankee Stadium. The only downside about those games is that the Rangers were considered the road team for those games, when you would think since it's Yankee Stadium, they should be considered the home team. But they were considered the road team for both, which actually ended up being a good thing because when you really think about it, last season, the Rangers were a much better road team than a home team. The first game would come on a Sunday at 12:30 in the afternoon against the New Jersey Devils, a game in which they were trailing 3-1, but then came back to just dominate the game and win by a final score of 7-3. Then, three days later, Wednesday night, they played the New York Islanders, and after trailing 1-0, they go on to win by a final score of 2-1, with Dan Carcillo scoring the game-winning goal. I actually had the privilege of being able to go to that game, even though I did not have the best seats. I sat in the bleacher section. This all came after a huge trade by the Rangers, sending defenseman Michael Del Zotto to the Nashville Predators to acquire Kevin Klein, which was a major change on defense, an offensive defenseman and power play quarterback, going from that to more of a shutdown defenseman who rushes the puck occasionally, but is more known for staying in his zone and blocking shots, which was a big change on the back end. But Kevin Klein adapted to New York very well, and the Rangers ended up getting the better of that trade because Klein was so good for the Rangers. Del Zotto was awful for the Predators, and he's not even a Predator anymore. He, of course, a couple days ago signed with the Philadelphia Flyers, and Klein is still a Ranger right now. So he ended up being a very valuable third-pair defenseman playing alongside John Moore. What really was the big change for Henrik Lundqvist on a personal note, where he finally managed to find his game, believe it or not, was being the starting goaltender for Team Sweden in the Olympics. He would pretty much carried that team, and one may say that the only reason Sweden didn't defeat Canada in that gold medal game was because of how many players up front Sweden was missing for that game. They lost Henrik Zetterberg in the first game. They lost him for the entire tournament. They didn't have Johan Franzen on that team at all. And then Nicholas Backstrom was unable to play the final game. He was banned from playing that final game. But Canada ended up winning that game 3-0, and Henrik Lundqvist and Team Sweden had to settle for a silver medal. But it wasn't all bad, because in that tournament, Hank had found his game, and he took it back to New York. And you think of the Rangers and how they've been historically since NHLers had been allowed to go to the Olympics. In each of the 4 years prior, they would not come off the Olympic breaks good at all. And they've only made it to the playoffs once in those 4 years, and even then, they were just starstruck. Lundqvist was sick, and they didn't play well. They lost, and they got killed in the first round in a 4-game sweep by the hands of the New Jersey Devils. So normally, that was a big fear for the New York Rangers, considering that history. How are they going to come out of the Olympic break, considering how poor they've been every single time? Well, they responded by coming out great. They would defeat the Chicago Blackhawks for a second time, this time at the Garden, by a final score of 2-1. Then they had a rough weekend. They got killed by the Philadelphia Flyers and the Boston Bruins, both road games. And then the trade deadline came, and the Rangers made 2 trades at the deadline, one being a minor trade, acquiring Rafael Diaz from the Vancouver Canucks in exchange for a pick. Both he and Dan Carcillo will not be on the team for the upcoming year. They're still unrestricted free agents, but the Rangers will not be bringing those 2 back. You know, I kind of like Carcillo, though. I thought he was very good for the Rangers. And even Diaz, when he did get the opportunities to play, he was very effective with his speed. But Carcillo, I actually will miss him in New York. I thought he was very good for the Rangers. I knew he wasn't going to come back. I already knew he wasn't going to be coming back. But I think, you know, in my opinion, you know, I thought he was a very valuable asset, and he really did change the Rangers' season. He really did turn their season around when he came to the team. But the big trade the Rangers made at the deadline was trading away their captain, Ryan Callahan, whom they could not get a deal done with, to the Tampa Bay Lightning, along with a couple of draft picks, a first-round pick for 2014, and then another pick for 2015, or actually it might have been the other way around. One first-round pick the Lightning got automatically. The other one they would only get if the Rangers made it to the Eastern Conference Finals, which they did. But with this trade made, the Rangers acquired veteran Marty St. Louis, and Marty St. Louis had demanded a trade during the Olympics. He said to Steve Yzerman he wanted to be traded. He did not want to play for the Tampa Bay Lightning anymore. And how did the trade work out? Well, early on, Ryan Callahan played very well for the Tampa Bay Lightning. He fit under their system much more than he did under Alain Vigneault, and he was scoring. He really was. As for Marty St. Louis, well, adapting to a new home was really tough for him. He did not score a goal, I believe, in his first 15 games as a Ranger. He only had one regular season goal with the Rangers. That came against the Vancouver Canucks. But he did do other things very, very well, and that's what fans do tend to forget. He had quite a few assists, particularly toward the end of the year. That's where he really started to finally adapt. He had a ton of assists. He actually developed some chemistry with Rick Nash. He was playing on that line for a little while when Chris Kreider went down. And yeah, he was great. I mean, San Luis started to finally pick up his game, but he only had that one goal. That didn't change. But the Rangers came out of the trade deadline. They played very well. And when the season finally ended, the Rangers finished as the 5th seed in the Eastern Conference and 2nd in the Metropolitan Division, finishing with a record of 45, 31-6 for 96 points. I don't think the Rangers really anticipated much in these playoffs. I think they knew they had the ability to defeat the Philadelphia Flyers in the first round, who was their first round opponent. They had home ice advantage. But one could argue that the only reason they beat the Flyers the way they did was because they didn't have Steve Mason for the entire series. Ray Emery did play well in Game 2. I'll give him that. But in Games 1 and 3, he was awful. But But the Rangers, with holding home ice advantage, would defeat the Philadelphia Flyers in 7 games, and they would advance to the second round where they took on another Pennsylvania rival, the Pittsburgh Penguins, a team who in their franchise history they had never defeated in the playoffs. And this was what I pretty much call the Miracle Series if you're the New York Rangers. They won the first game in overtime. Derek Brassard got the overtime winner. And then through the next 3 games, the Penguins just dominated. They killed the Rangers in the next 3 games. Sidney Crosby got the game-winning goal in game number 3. They were just dominant. They went on to take a 3-1 series lead. But then, what changed the series? What turned the series around? Well, as horrible as this is to say, probably the death of Martin St. Louis' mother. And very tragic, though. Again, she will be missed. She was very much missed. But at the same time, it motivated the rest of the team. It didn't motivate Marty St. Louis right away, though. It took had an extended effect on him. He did not play well in Game 5, but the rest of the team played well enough to back him up, and they just destroyed the Penguins in Game 5. 5-1 was the final score. Game number 6, that was when Marty St. Louis took it upon himself to take the team on his back. And he dominated Game 6. The Rangers won Game 6 3-1. By the way, that's the other thing. Ryan Callahan, as good as he was in the regular season with the Lightning, he did not have a single goal in the playoffs. Marty St. Louis was the Rangers' best player in the playoffs, bar none, without question. And game number 7, Rangers, surprisingly enough, tied the series, send Game 7 to Pittsburgh, and then Dominic Moore scores the game-winning goal. In game number 7, the Rangers steal Game 7 by a final score of 2-1, knowing that the Penguins were a much better team, and history was made in 2 ways for the New York Rangers. One, they defeated the Pittsburgh Penguins for the first time ever in the playoffs. Second, for the first time in franchise history, the Rangers would win a series after falling to a 3-1 series deficit. They had never won a series when trailing 3-1. So, no better time than that to make history if you're the New York Rangers against a team they had never beaten in the playoffs before. That's just unbelievable. But that was the Miracle Series for the Rangers. In the Eastern Conference Finals, they took on the Montreal Canadiens. And that was a series that had a lot of questions to it because of the Rangers' rough history, or rough recent history, at the Bell Center. It had been called the House of Horrors for the Rangers over the recent years. Well, the Rangers dominated. They won both games 1 and 2 at the Bell Center. Montreal stole Game 3 in overtime, a game that the Rangers dominated. But the Rangers paid the Montreal right back. Montreal dominated Game 4 at the Garden, but the Rangers came back to win that game in overtime. Marty St. Louis got the overtime winner. Game 5 was a weird one. Montreal kind of dominated that game. The Rangers came back from 4-1 down to tie the game, but Montreal just came right back to win that game. Rennie Bourque had a hat trick. Henrik Lundqvist, that was the only game of the playoffs where he was pulled. That was Cam Talbot's only playoff action. He didn't even play well, though, in that game. And then Game 6, back at the Garden, very close game, 1-0 the final score. Dominic Moore comes up huge again, getting the only goal for the Rangers in that game. He was so big for the Rangers in that postseason. So the Rangers beat the Montreal Canadiens in 6 games to win the Prince of Wales Trophy as the Eastern Conference champions. They went all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, but that's unfortunately where everything had to come to an end. If you were a New York Rangers fan, they were burnt out by the time they got there, and they played a much different demon in the Los Angeles Kings, a team that was fresh from that 2012 team that defeated the arch-rival New Jersey Devils in 6 games. But it was a fresh roster from that team from 2 seasons ago. They had barely lost anybody from that team. And the Kings, they were just a totally different demon for the New York Rangers. There was no way they were going to beat the Kings. But at the same time, in each of the home in each of the home games for the Kings, in each of the Rangers road games, they blew each and every one of those games. All three of those games ended in overtime. Game 1, they had a 2-0 lead. Kings come back to win 3-2 in overtime. 3-2 in overtime. But one will tell you that the Rangers didn't really deserve to win that game anyway. The Kings kind of dominated that one. That was a legit comeback. Game number 2, Rangers hold a 4-2 lead in that game, and then they get absolutely screwed over, which not only cost the Rangers the game, but I think that it also cost them the series. A clear goaltender interference by Dwight King led to a goal that made it 4-3, and that goaltender interference was not called by the referees. It was a clear goaltender interference that should have been called, but that killed the Rangers, and that made them unmotivated, that took their motivation away. And the Marian Gaborik, the former Ranger, ties the game, and then the Kings come back to win 5-4 in overtime. Game 3 at the Garden was kind of a weird one. That was the only game of that series where the Rangers dominated in shots, but Henrik Lundqvist had a poor performance in that game. 3-0 was the final score of that one. That game was all about Jonathan Quick. Game number 4 at the Garden, I don't know how the Rangers even survived, lived to see another day. Rangers facing elimination. They got dominated in that game, outshot 41-19, but that was Henrik Lundqvist's night to shine. The Rangers won that game, stole that game by a final score of 2-1. But the Rangers did make NHL history with that game, setting a record for most consecutive wins at home when facing elimination in one postseason. Or actually, not in one postseason, just in history. So even though the Rangers lost that series, they did set some NHL history, which is pretty darn good when you think about it. And then Game 5, back in LA, Rangers get screwed over again. They hold a 2-1 lead in the game, and then another bad call by the referees. A slew foot between by Jake Muzzin on Matt Zuccarello. Clearly a penalty that should have gone to Jake Muzzin. They give it to Matt Zuccarello instead, and Marian Gaborik, the former Ranger, goes on to score on the power play to tie the game, and then Alec Martinez goes on to score the cup-winning goal off a rebound. So, a tough break for the New York Rangers, putting an end to what was a magical Cinderella run for the Rangers, and it really was. You know, even though they got killed in the Stanley Cup Finals, one could tell you that they kind of got screwed over a couple times. And that really was an inspiration for the city of New York as a whole. When you consider how bad 2013, at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014 was for the city of New York sports in general. Just every single sport when you think about it. With both the Jets and the Giants missing the playoffs in the 2013 season. Both the Yankees and Mets missing the playoffs for 2013. The New York Knicks having an awful season in basketball. They didn't make the playoffs in 2013-14. And for hockey, the New York Islanders missing the playoffs, having a major setback year from the lockout-shortened year. And the New Jersey Devils missing the playoffs for a second straight year. They're not New York, but they're a local team, so you kind of got to factor them in. And if you want to even take it further, if you want to include the Buffalo teams, both the Buffalo Sabres, worst team in the NHL, and the Buffalo Bills had another awful season. The Brooklyn Nets made the playoffs, but honestly, it was not a very good playoff run at all. I mean, they went to a 7-game series with the Toronto Raptors, and even though they won that series, that was a series that they should have killed the Raptors, and it was much closer than it should have been. And then in the second round, they just get absolutely killed, I believe, by the Washington Wizards, if I'm correct. Or no, they got killed by the Miami Heat. They ran into the Miami Heat. That's what happened to them. But so for the New York Rangers, when you consider all they had to go through, plus the horrendous start that they had, when you put all of that into consideration, it was just such a tough time for the city of New York and for the Rangers to go all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, even though they didn't win. The fact that they got there just spoke a lot of volumes for the city of New York, and it gave the city of New York something to hope for. You really got to give a lot of credit to the Rangers. They did great, and whether you love them or whether you hate them, you just got to give them so much credit, and they deserved the kind of season that they had. They deserved to be in the finals. They earned their place in the standings, and, they just did a lot to inspire the city. And it's really fantastic. It's truly a Cinderella story, even though they didn't win. But now going back to reality, after the frustration and disappointment, a few days later, got to get back to work, and that's where we kind of are now. The 2014 off season is in. The New York Rangers had, after celebrating the fact that they even made it that far, you always got to get back to work very soon after. And for the big thing for the New York Rangers, they knew going into the 2014-15 season they were not going to have the same team. They knew this season they were not going to have the same team, not because of anyone playing poorly, but because of cap reasons. And it all started with the Rangers using their second compliance buyout on forward Brad Richards. Brad Richards had somewhat of a comeback year from the lockout Jordan year, and when Ryan Callahan left, even though the Rangers were left without a captain, they had 3 alternates, Brad Richards was one of them. He was pretty much the de facto captain when Ryan Callahan left. He was the guy leading the charts. He was the guy speaking in the locker room. And I think part of the reason why he was doing this was because he and the team and the fans knew that regardless of if he had a good year or not, the Rangers were going to buy him out anyway, and they had no choice. It was something they had to do. It was something they had to do. They were way too close to the cap, and he was making way too much money over the span of 6 more seasons. They had to buy him out. That was the Rangers' second compliance buyout. They used the first one, obviously, on defenseman Wade Redden all those years back. But yeah, I mean, for Brad Richards, he even though he didn't want to leave the city of New York and the Rangers, I don't really think Glenn Sather really wanted to get rid of him. It was something they had to do. Because Brad Richards had a very solid regular season, 20 goals, 51 points, and he was very solid throughout the first 3 rounds of the playoffs. He did not play well in the Stanley Cup Finals. That was the one round where he did not play well. He looked more like the Brad Richards from the lockout Jordan year in the Stanley Cup Finals. But that was just the first of many departures. Another move that the Rangers made for cap reasons was trading away Derek Dorsett to the Vancouver Canucks for the 89th overall pick in the draft, the same third-round pick that Vancouver got in the Ryan Kessler deal. The Rangers used that pick to select goaltender Brandon Halverson, a goaltender who they have some high expectations for. I don't think Derek Dorsett really ever became what the Rangers wanted him to be, but he was without a doubt one of their best players in the Stanley Cup Finals. That could not be denied. He was very good in the Stanley Cup Finals. And then the rest of the players they lost via free agency. They lost a couple of minor players. Justin Falk was their 7th defenseman. He went to the Minnesota Wild. And then Stu Bickle, even though he didn't play last year, he was a part of their 2011-2012 team, and a big part of that team. He is just completely fell off their depth chart, and he really never was the same after that year. The Rangers let him go. He also went to the Minnesota Wild. But then they also had 3 losses via free agency that were very significant pieces during their playoff run. Brian Boyle and Anton Strawman, they both left. They both went to the Tampa Bay Lightning. Brian Boyle at times was quite arguably their most consistent player throughout those playoffs. Face-offs, winning face-offs, killing penalties, putting on pressure. He was so good for the Rangers in those playoffs. And then, of course, Anton Strawman, with what he did defensively. Even though I really don't feel like he had a great regular season, in the playoffs he was fantastic. He blocked shots. He did everything. He was pretty much the anchor on the Rangers' blue line defensively. He was probably a better shutdown defenseman in the playoffs than Dan Girardi. Dan Girardi had a terrible postseason. I must say, he did not. It wasn't his best regular season, and he had a terrible postseason, especially in the Stanley Cup Finals. He really was not that good. So Anton Stralman, kind of a big loss for the Rangers blue line, but both he and Brian Boyle would reunite with Ryan Callahan and the Tampa Bay Lightning. And Cali convinced both of them to come over, and they both accepted. And then the other big departure for the Rangers, and maybe arguably the biggest one of all, Benoit Pouliot. The Rangers got Pouliot from the Lightning, believe it or not. And it's hard to believe, at the beginning of the year, he was such a non-factor for the team. He was a healthy scratch on many occasions. He was their 13th forward. But when he finally scored the goal to give himself the confidence in a 4-1 loss to Washington, his game just turned around, and he just became such a consistent player for them. He, along with Derek Brassard and Matt Zuccarello, formed what was, without a doubt, the best third line in the National Hockey League, without question. And Benoit Pouliot, though, he wanted way more money than maybe he deserves. He definitely doesn't deserve the kind of years or money that he was asking for, and the Rangers were not willing to give him that kind of a contract, considering how close to the cap they were, which is quite understandable. Benoit Pouliot went on to sign with the Edmonton Oilers, so he is now a member of the Edmonton Oilers. So we'll see how that experiment goes. But he also was one of the Rangers' best performers in the playoffs. The one thing they'll definitely miss about Benoit Pouliot is his talent and his ability on the rush. What they won't miss about Benoit Pouliot is his offensive zone penalties. That's the one downside about this player. So for the New York Rangers, with all these departures, additions had to be made as well. And luckily for the Rangers, with the buying out of Brad Richards and trading away Derek Dorsett, it all of a sudden gave the Rangers the cap they needed to not only re-sign their key restricted free agents, which they still have a couple others that they have the money to re-sign, but also bring in the pieces they need to bring in to fill the holes left behind. And it really all starts with their biggest and really their only real big free agent signing this offseason. He's bringing in 38-year-old veteran defenseman Dan Boyle, coming over from the San Jose Sharks. He spent the last 6 seasons with the San Jose Sharks, had his rights traded to the New York Islanders during the offseason. Islanders traded away a draft pick to get him. I think it was a mid-round pick, and he refused to sign with the Islanders. So to make things bad for the Islanders, they not only wasted a draft pick, but to make things worse for the Islanders, he ended up signing with the arch-rival New York Rangers to 2 years at $9 million. That's $4.5 million a year. Teams like the Red Wings, the Panthers, and even the Lightning were very much interested in his services, but he chose the New York Rangers because of his friendship with Marty St. Louis. And to me, even though he's much older than Anton Stralman, in a way it's kind of an upgrade from him, because the Rangers had a lot of shutdown defensemen. What they've needed for a long time was another offensive defenseman, one who could play with Mark Stahl, which is where Dan Boyle will probably play, and one who could alleviate some pressure off Ryan McDonagh and help out as another power play quarterback. He'll replace Brad Richards as the power play quarterback. He's got a right-handed shot. And last year with the Sharks, he actually had a pretty good year. Every year he's been with the Sharks, he's been their best defenseman, bar none. But last year, he played 75 games, and through 75 games, he had 12 goals, 24 assists, 36 points, which isn't bad for his age. Only 32 penalty minutes and 154 shots on goal. He was a -8, but at the same, when you really think about it and when it all comes down to it, he's really not a shutdown defenseman. He's an offensive defenseman and a power play specialist. So he's not a guy who's going to go out there and block shots and play the penalty kill. He's a power play specialist, nothing more. And he's a power play specialist with very good skating ability, great stick handling, and actually one of the few defensemen in the NHL who could actually be used in the shootout. Very good defenseman in the shootout. Very gifted hands when it comes to the shootout. The Sharks always used him in the shootouts, and I would bet that the Rangers will definitely use him as well. During the playoffs, not as good of a postseason for Dan Boyle as it had been in past years. Through all 7 games played, he didn't have a single goal. He did have 4 assists, though. He only had 8 penalty minutes, but he did generate 17 shots on goal, which is pretty good. He was a -1 in the playoffs, though, but once again, not a shutdown defenseman. So, this is the key addition for the Rangers. He was another member of that 2004 Tampa Bay Lightning team that won the Stanley Cup. He was with Marty St. Louis on that team. They're reunited now. I mean, Brad Richards was part of that team too, but he's no longer with the team, obviously. He went on to sign, I actually forgot to mention, he went on to sign with the Chicago Blackhawks to become their second-line center. But again, even if the Rangers had kept Brad Richards, who knows how good he would have been. He's not getting any younger, and his skating ability is losing itself. He's losing his skating ability. He doesn't have the same step that he had all those years ago. But this was the big Rangers signing. Dan Boyle, even at his age, can still skate. And by the standards of the National Hockey League, has always been considered one of the very few players at his age that can still play the game. And he can still play the game. He has that potential. The big question now for him is, can he do it with the New York Rangers? We all know Glenn Sather's history of bringing in these veteran players that were once stars but are now completely out of their prime, and then they end up being disappointments. Dan Boyle, you got to think that he's kind of going to be in that same category because he's 38 years of age. So it's going to be interesting to see, what kind of impact he has, whether he can be the same Dan Boyle, at least for this season, and if he can be the power play anchor, the power play quarterback that they expect him to be. Oh, yeah, and good news for you guys who had Brian Boyle jerseys. Guess what? You get to keep those jerseys because Dan Boyle will be wearing number 22 just like Brian Boyle did. So you don't even need to go out and get any Dan Boyle jerseys because your Brian Boyle jersey is your Dan Boyle jersey now. So good news for the fans. Just wanted to point that out quite randomly. But yeah, Dan Boyle, again, he's the big signing by the Rangers. He'll be making $4.5 million a year. That's a $9 million deal over the course of 2 seasons. But other than that, all the other signings that the Rangers made were really to fill in more of depth roles. We're really to fill in some depth roles, like a Lee Stempniak, a Tanner Glass, a Matthew Lombardi type players, and those are really the only other significant signings. Every other signing they made was really for the American Hockey League. I mean, we'll just talk about these 3 guys: Lee Stempniak and Tanner Glass. Both those guys coming over from the Pittsburgh Penguins. Let's start with Tanner Glass. Tanner Glass, I don't know. I kind of have mixed feelings about this signing because he's 30 years of age. Rangers signed him to a 3-year deal. And I think he's making $1.3 million a year or something like that. But he's now officially one of the most overpaid fourth liners in the league over the course of the next 3 seasons. And this is for a player who, by most standards, was considered one of the worst even strength forwards in the game this past year. But he's not the same player he was 2 years ago at the Winnipeg Jets, and his 2 years with the Pittsburgh Penguins, he really was nothing special. His best season came in 2011-2012 with the Winnipeg Jets. He combined with Chris Thorburn, and I forget who the other guy was. I forget who the other guy was. I think it was James Wright or something like that. I forget who it was, but whoever they were. No, Tim Stapleton, that's who it was. They combined with Chris Thorburn and Tim Stapleton to form one of the most devastating fourth lines in the National Hockey League. Tanner Glass was very good playing on that fourth line. But when he came to Pittsburgh, he really didn't play well. Last year with the Pittsburgh Penguins, he played 67 games, and he only had 4 goals, 9 assists, 13 points. He was a -8, but then again, he's always a minus player. He's not a defensive player, and he's not known for scoring points. What he's known for is his hitting and his penalty minutes. He had 90 penalty minutes last year and 56 shots on goal. And through 8 playoff games played, he only played in 8 games. He didn't have a single point. He was even in the plus-minus. He had 4 penalty minutes, and he had 10 shots on goal. So it's kind of I'm two-sided about the signing. In one sense, the Rangers, with trading away Derek Dorsett and knowing Dan Carcillo, he's definitely not going to be back. The Rangers did need an enforcer, a guy who's going to give them energy, and Tanner Glass is really the best guy available, I guess. He'll wear Derek Dorsett's number 15. And what if Tanner Glass, though, is playing well, and if he does get himself back to the way he was in that 1 year with the Winnipeg Jets, he's not the kind of skater that Derek Dorsett was or that Brandon Prust was. He's not that kind of an enforcer. He's not a guy who's going to generate forechecking, who's going to generate on the forecheck and hit on the forecheck. He's just a pure grit guy who's going to hit maybe in the neutral zone or the defensive zone, and he's going to drop the gloves. That's basically what Tanner Glass is. He is a pure enforcer. He's a guy who drops the gloves and fights, and that's what the Rangers did need. A guy who's going to fight when the going gets tough. Again, he's not a great skater, though. He's an okay skater, but not as good a skater as, say, Derek Dorsett or Dan Carcillo or even Brandon Prust. He's not, or even Aaron Asham for that matter. He's not as good of a skater as any of those guys. He's just a guy, he's kind of one of those stand-up type enforcers who would just stand you up at the neutral zone and hit that way. So that's Tanner Glass. That's pretty much what the Rangers are getting with this guy. But then with the other Pittsburgh Penguin they're getting, Lee Stempniak, I kind of consider this to be one of the more interesting signings by the Rangers. Lee Stempniak split last season between the Calgary Flames and the Pittsburgh Penguins. He was acquired by the Penguins at the trade deadline. With the Calgary Flames, though, he had played 52 games, scoring 8 goals, 15 assists, and 23 points. With only 28 penalty minutes and 144 shots on goal, he was one of their best penalty-killing forwards, and in the 2.5 years he's been there, he's been one of their best penalty-killing forwards. He was a -21 with the Calgary Flames, but again, that was him playing on a bad team. Then he gets traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and he plays much better, playing 21 games and scoring 4 goals, 7 assists, and 11 points. He was a +5 with the Pittsburgh Penguins, only 4 penalty minutes and 34 shots on goal. And then through 13 playoff games with the Penguins, in the playoffs he wasn't as good, only 2 goals and 1 assist, 3 points, and he was a -4 in the playoffs, 6 penalty minutes, and only 22 shots on goal. So he wasn't as good in the playoffs. But in the regular season when he came over, he was slotted on the line with Sidney Crosby and Chris Kunitz. He was basically brought in to take on Pascal Dupuis's role because he's a very similar type player to Pascal Dupuis. And he did really well. So overall, last season, he played 73 games, scored 12 goals, 22 assists, and 34 points. He was a -16 on the year, but again, most of that minus came while playing on a bad team with the Calgary Flames. 32 penalty minutes and 178 shots on goal. So overall, it was a pretty good year. He was one area where he was very good was the penalty kill. Always one of the better penalty killing forwards in the league, and that's what the Rangers needed in him. They needed a penalty killer who could take on Brian Boyle's role and be a good penalty killer and play either the third or fourth line. One would anticipate the third line. And the Rangers got him for very cheap, actually. He was a very cheap signing. They only had to give him 1 year and only $900,000. Kind of an experiment type thing to see how well he does. He understood that, and so he took it because it's very possible he ends up in Hartford as well. He's not a lock for the team because the Rangers have a lot of good youngsters coming up that could take a role. But he was given number 12, which Jesper Fast wore last year. Jesper Fast changed to 91. Offered to change his number, though. He will now wear number 91 for the upcoming year. But Lee Stempniak, if he's playing at his best, he's a defensive forward who blocks shots, but also can generate a bit of offense, has some good hands, and score some clutch goals. He is a clutch goal scorer when he's playing at his best. So, honestly, I really think the Rangers got him at a bargain, because if he is a disappointment, it's no big deal. It's a low-risk contract. So, very good signing by the Rangers, in my opinion, whether he becomes a steal or a disappointment. And then the other interesting signing by the Rangers, signing forward Matthew Lombardi, who spent last season playing in the Swiss League, and all he did last year in the Swiss League was dominate that league, leading the league in scoring. He led the league with 20 goals and 50 points, and the team he was playing for would go on to win the Spengler Cup, and he was the best player in those playoffs as well. But last time he played in the NHL was during the lockout-shortened year, a season he split between the Phoenix Coyotes and the Anaheim Ducks. The Anaheim Ducks were the last team he played for before departing for the Swiss League. But he was so good in the Swiss League, and after 1 year there, at 32 years of age, he returns to the NHL. Rangers signed him to a 2-year deal, I believe worth around $1.9 million overall. But another kind of interesting signing, because again, he spent all of last year in the Swiss League. Very speedy player. That's what Matthew Lombardi is known for, his speed. He's a fast player who can make some plays. He's more of a playmaker than a goal scorer, but he's more of a defensive forward than anything. Very good two-way forward or with great speed, but the big problem with him is that he's always hurt. He can never stay healthy, or at least that was the case in the NHL. Last year in the Swiss League, he was very healthy. But until then, in the last 3 seasons prior, he was just constantly hurt. He only played 2 games with the Nashville Predators in 2010-2011. He missed 20 games with the Toronto Maple Leafs the following year, and in the lockout year with the Coyotes and the Ducks. I don't even know how many games he played, but this is a very interesting signing, and again, another low-risk signing. Even though it's for 2 years instead of 1 year, it's for a very low cost, and the Rangers could easily make him a 13th forward if he does disappoint. And he's another guy who's not necessarily guaranteed a roster spot because of some of the youngsters coming up. But if he does live out to be what the Rangers think he'll be, again, he's going to generate a lot of speed for the team and great forward checking. I personally think he has the potential to have a comeback, have his career get back in shape after some time in the Swiss League. But we'll see. We'll see what he does. At the very least, he will be on the Rangers penalty kill. And he'll definitely be a guy battling for a third-line center position. There's no doubt about it. And then other than those 3 signings, or actually 4 if you include the Dan Boyle signing, the other signings they made were really nothing significant and more or less for the Hartford Wolfpack. Matt Hunwick, who's coming over from the Colorado Avalanche. Michael Koska coming over from the Tampa Bay Lightning. Those are actually 2 guys who will battle for the 7th defenseman spot. Connor Allen will probably battle for that as well. Those 3 guys, Michael Koska, Matt Hunwick, and Connor Allen, they will battle for the honor of being the 7th defenseman for the Rangers this year. Steven Kampfer coming over from the Minnesota Wild. Chris Mueller, who was a star forward for the Texas Stars last year, en route to winning the Calder Cup with them when they defeated the Toronto Marlies. But he also got some games in with the Dallas Stars as well, so he's coming over from the Dallas Stars. He actually has the potential to make the team as well as like a 13th or 14th forward, but he will also probably spend some time down in Hartford. He's a very good scorer in the American Hockey League. Cedric Desjardins, who's also coming over from the Tampa Bay Lightning, they needed goaltending for the Hartford Wolfpack, and he'll be the starter down in Hartford. And then forward Nick Tarnasky, who hasn't played at the NHL level in a very long time. Last time he's been in the Montreal Canadiens system playing for the Hamilton Bulldogs. He now comes to the Hartford Wolfpack. And actually the Hartford Wolfpack made a signing yesterday, bringing in forward Ryan Patolny. He's probably just going to stay in the AHL. He has NHL experience, though. He's coming over from Europe. So, after spending a couple years there. So, nothing really too significant. And then, of course, the Rangers did manage to re-sign Dominic Moore as an unrestricted free agent. They signed the 33-year-old to a 2-year deal. And that was a big surprise because at one point it looked like the Rangers weren't going to be able to re-sign Moore. So, it really looked like Moore wasn't going to get re-signed, but they managed to re-sign him. He's back with the Rangers, and I'm glad he is. He was so good for them during the playoffs. And then the Rangers, the good news for them, they were able to get all their key restricted free agents signed over the span of the last month. They got Matt Zuccarello and Chris Kreider both signed to bridge deals. Matt Zuccarello was signed to a 1-year deal, and Chris Kreider was signed to a 2-year deal, which is something I figured would happen. I mean, actually, I kind of thought Zuccarello would get 2 years as well. Kind of surprised he only got 1 year. But then they managed to get Derek Brassard locked up long-term. 5 years at $25 million. That's $5 million a year. Great return for the Rangers. He'll be a Ranger for a very long time. And now with Brad Richards gone, he'll be now relied on to be the number 2 center rather than the number 3 center, while Derek Stepan will be the number 1 center, of course. He won't have to battle for that job anymore. He's now the official full-time number 1 center, which brings us to some of the questions about the Rangers this year. Can a guy like Dan Boyle help replace both Brad Richards and Anton Strawman? Replacing Brad Richards on the power play and replacing Anton Strawman on the defense overall. Well, what's good about this signing, though, is that he is a right-handed shot, just like Strawman was, so they remain even as far as their left-handed and right-handed shots. I think, again, Dan Boyle, definitely a much different player from Strawman, an offensive defenseman, whereas Strawman's a shutdown, a defensive defenseman. But, he still can be a very effective player, Dan Boyle. Even at his age, I'm very confident that he can still be a very effective player for them, at the very least this year. How will the Rangers supplement the forward depth they lost, particularly at center? Again, losing Brad Richards leaves holes at center because Derek Stepan, you think of him, he's more of a second-line center type guy who's playing on the top line, and then Derek Dorsett, he's more of a third-line center type guy. He's now going to have to play the second-line center role. And then, of course, Dominic Moore is is the fourth-line center. But then you have a battle for that third-line center spot. It'll definitely be between guys like Matthew Lombardi and the youngster JT Miller, who's, I think, is definitely going to play full-time this year. There's no doubt about it. But those two guys will battle for the third-line center spot. We'll see what happens, and hopefully a guy like JT Miller can end up becoming the player that the Rangers think he can become, and if he becomes that player that they think he can become, he could eventually take the role as the number 1 center or even a number 1 winger. We'll see, though. Will the Rangers sign Mark Stahl to an extension? For Mark Stahl, this is the last year on his contract. He becomes an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year, and now he's the big player that the Rangers will try to get locked up long term. The Rangers want to get a deal done with him, and he wants to stay with the Rangers. So hopefully they can get a deal done at some point during the year. That will be the Rangers' big focus as the season progresses. Who will replace Benoit Pouliot on that key left wing spot? That, of course, is a major question that really can't be answered right now, but we'll see. And can Rick Nash return to elite form, Rick Nash has been an interesting story in New York. I feel like he hasn't exactly been the Rick Nash that we're still waiting to see in New York. So this kind of has to be a breakout year for Rick Nash if the Rangers want to take it to another step, take it another level, take it a step higher. Rick Nash has to be better, and he has to be back to being the old Rick Nash. But to me, that center depth is a big question. That is probably the biggest question for me. As we now take a look at the Rangers lineup and what the roster could look like for this year, you got Derek, the first line is very obvious, of course. Derek Stepan, Chris Kreider, and Rick Nash. They have Chris Kreider on the right side, but that'll change. Chris Kreider's going to play the left side. Rick Nash will stay on that right side, that off wing, where he's very comfortable. But we'll see. I mean, I'm sure that would actually be a good experiment, putting Nash on the left side and Kreider on the right side. That, to me, would actually be a pretty good experiment to try out. But we'll see. As far as that, but those guys, of course, that's been the top line since Rick Nash arrived, since the playoffs during the lockout shortened year, and those three guys have great chemistry together. So that is without question the top line. So what the second line could look like, it could have Derek Brassard centering Marty St. Louis, who has a year left on his deal, and Carl Hagelin, who they'll also think about who also becomes an RFA at the end of the year. They'll maybe try to get him signed as well. But, again, Derek Brassard, not a third-line center anymore, at least for right now. He's going to have to take on more responsibility, and guys like St. Louis and Hagelin could help him out with that. Third line, could be JT Miller, Lee Stempniak, and Matt Zuccarello. This is the interesting thing because Zuccarello, much more comfortable on the right side, could be forced to move to the left side for next year. He was the Rangers' leading point scorer last year among players who were on the Rangers for the whole year. That does not include Marty St. Louis, but not including Marty St. Louis, Zuccarello led the Rangers with 55 points last year. He had a major career year, and he hopes he can repeat that success. And then the fourth line, Dominic Moore, Jesper Foss, and Matthew Lombardi, with Tanner Glass as the 13th forward and Chris Mueller as the 14th forward. There's no doubt that both Jesper Foss and JT Miller are ready for full-time roles at the NHL level. There's no doubt about that. But this is where the Rangers, are going to have most of their questions for the upcoming year up front. On defense, they're without a doubt always one of the best defense corps in the league. Ryan McDonagh, Dan Girardi, Mark Stahl, Dan Boyle. He'll take Anton Strawman's spot. He'll play with Mark Stahl. Kevin Klein, John Moore. Well, John Moore actually has to get signed. He's still a restricted free agent, but there's no doubt that the Rangers will get a bridge deal done with him. I see a 1-year, $1 million deal in his near future. And then the thought is that Michael Koska will probably be the seventh defenseman. He really broke out when he got traded to the Tampa Bay Lightning from the Chicago Blackhawks last year. And then, of course, in goal, you got the King, Henrik Lundqvist, and the guy who's being renowned as the Prince, Cam Talbot. This is going to be a kind of a interesting year for Cam Talbot. He's actually going to be watched quite a bit this year as a backup goalie because he becomes an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year. And if he does play well, because there's no way he could start as a Ranger, you got to think that he'll try to find a home elsewhere where he could potentially be a starter. And they got other guys who are also in the mix to come up. Chris Bourque, who actually was another signing coming over from Europe, could play. Matt Hunwick, Connor Allen, Cedric Desjardins, he's the third goalie. And then Danny Cristo, who actually is one of the Rangers' top prospects. However, he's a restricted free agent as well. The Rangers do need to get him signed as well. So John Moore and Danny Cristo both need to be signed. Then the Rangers will pretty much be set for the coming year. But yep. And actually, there was one other question I completely forgot about, and probably this might actually be the big one for me. Who becomes the Rangers captain this year? Again, when Ryan Callahan left, they were left with three alternates: Brad Richards, Mark Stahl, and Dan Girardi. Dan Girardi was given the third A. But Brad Richards was pretty much the de facto captain, but he probably would have been the captain if he was still there, but he's no longer with the Rangers, and now you really got to think about who's going to be the captain. Could it be Mark Stahl or Dan Girardi? They were the two A's. I don't think it's going to be either of those guys, believe it or not. I actually think a guy who wasn't wearing a letter at all last year, Ryan McDonagh, I think would be a great option to be the Rangers' next captain. He pretty much was the other leader out there. I think he showed more leadership than both Girardi and Stahl combined. He pretty much is the best defenseman on the team and has proven to become one of the best defensemen in the league, and he's really become something, Ryan McDonagh. I think he becomes the next Ranger captain, but we'll see. Could be Girardi, could be Stahl, could even be a forward like Derek Stepan, who has leadership. He was the captain of Team USA's World Junior Championship gold medal winning team back in 2010. So he's got some leadership abilities. But we'll see. It's going to be interesting to see who becomes the captain of the Rangers this year, if they even name a captain this season. We'll see as we now take a look at the Rangers' top 10 prospects. For the New York Rangers, last year their top 10 prospect pool was quite disappointing. This year it's a lot better. Like the Carolina Hurricanes, a much deeper prospect pool this year than it was last year. Is it the deepest in the Metropolitan Division, though? Not even close. It is deeper than I think it is deeper than that of the Carolina Hurricanes, and I actually think it matches up to that of the New Jersey Devils. It's pretty much locked in a tie with the New Jersey Devils' top 10 prospects, maybe even slightly better, but it's not as good as the New York Islanders, not as good as the Philadelphia Flyers, not as good as the Washington Capitals, and nowhere near as good as the Columbus Blue Jackets. They have the deepest group in the Metropolitan Division so far. Obviously, we have one more team to go in the Pittsburgh Penguins, so we'll see when it comes to that. But the Rangers, I think, have a pretty interesting number one in Brady Shea. I actually disagree with him being the number one guy. I think he's going to be a very good player. He was the Rangers' 28th overall pick back in 2012, the last first-round pick they actually had. But I think there's some other even more interesting players on this list, like Anthony Duclair. Jesper Fast is on there. He's going to play full-time this coming season. He's actually the only player on this list who's going to play for the upcoming year. But other guys as well. He had Jesper Fast on there. Danny Cristo, who was their number one guy last year, got demoted to number 4. They say his projected NHL arrival is for 1 season away. He could challenge for a spot this year, but that is, of course, if the Rangers do sign him, which I think they will. Dylan McElrath's another guy, their first-round pick from 2010. Pavel Buchnevich, another real interesting Russian player. He's becoming a real good Russian player, and he'll be someone for the Rangers to watch. Connor Allen, who played 3 games last year when Dan Girardi was hurt. Oscar Lindberg, who actually is a very interesting guy. I like Oscar Lindberg. He actually kind of reminds me a little bit, as far as his shooting goes, his shot reminds me of Henrik Zetterberg. Will he become Henrik Zetterberg? That remains to be seen. Brandon Halverson, of course, was their top pick from this past draft. 59th overall in the second round. He pretty much will be relied on to be their goaltender of the future, because Henrik Lundqvist, as good as he is, let's face it, he's not getting any younger. Ryan Graves as well is also on that list. But the prospect on this top 10 list who strikes my eye more than anybody on this list, and no one's going to argue with me about this one, without a doubt, is their number 2 prospect, left winger Anthony Duclair. Anthony Duclair was one of 3 third-round picks by the Rangers in that very deep 2013 draft held in New Jersey. And of those 3 third-round picks, Anthony Duclair was the latter of those third-round picks. He was the last member of those third-round picks, with their number 6 prospect Pavel Buchnevich being number 2, and a guy who isn't even on this list, Adam Tambellini, being number 1. Adam Tambellini was the top third-round pick. Then came Pavel Buchnevich, and Anthony Duclair was the last one. However, experts will tell you he's probably become the best of those 3 third-round picks. A disappointing year in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League in his draft year kind of prevented him from being higher, but this year, a major comeback year for him. Through 59 games played with the Quebec Ramparts of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, 50 goals, 49 assists, 99 points. The bad news, though, is that he suffered an injury that ended his season, which tells you if he were healthy the whole year, he would have exceeded those points and probably would have gotten to the 100-point mark. I think this is a great prospect for the Rangers and their fans to watch. He is the future of New York Rangers hockey, and he is going to be a top 6 forward in the future, even a top line guy. I think the Rangers should be looking very closely at this kid. He's going to be someone who's really going to excite the fans. Unbelievable hands, great skating ability. He's got it all. He's going to be one heck of a player in the future for the New York Rangers, and they have a lot to look forward to for this kid. He needs another year of development. Actually, he may even need 2 years with that injury. You always kind of think 1 year will be to see how he recovers from that injury. The second year will probably be 1 year in the American Hockey League. So we'll see. I think this is going to be a very interesting player. Now, in my opinion, for the New York Rangers to duplicate the success that they had this past year, the player on the New York Rangers who has to be better this year in order for the New York Rangers to duplicate the kind of success they had last year, without a doubt, has to be Dan Girardi. And why Dan Girardi? Well, let's face it. Over the last couple of years, his overall play has declined really fast. Last season was probably the worst season of his NHL career, bar none. He was very inconsistent during the regular season, and in the playoffs he was even worse, particularly in the Stanley Cup Finals. It was his fault that they lost in Game 1. And he surrendered the overtime winning goal by Justin Williams. And he really was not the same Dan Girardi last year. When you look at his overall statistics last year, he played 81 games, 5 goals, 19 assists, 24 points, which I guess isn't bad. And he was a +6, which is really good too. And he only had 16 penalty minutes, and he did have 100 shots on goal. But despite that, one could tell you that he didn't block as many shots as we're used to seeing a guy like Dan Girardi block. And in the playoffs, only 1 goal, 6 assists, 7 points. But again, it's not the points that you look at with Dan Girardi because he's a shutdown defenseman. It's the plus-minus, and in the playoffs, he was a -3, which is awful. 10 penalty minutes, a career high in the playoffs, and 19 shots on goal. So he was actually in the regular season, I guess he wasn't too bad, but during the playoffs, the 30-year-old was just absolutely terrible. I think if the Rangers are going to duplicate that success, Dan Girardi has to be better. He needs to get back to being that shot-blocking defenseman who we know he can be. He may not be the flashiest skater, and believe me, he really is not a great skater at all. But despite that, he's still a very effective athlete. He's a very good athlete. And he's relied on to be the Rangers' key shutdown defenseman, even more so than Mark Stahl. So Girardi has to be that guy. He needs to be better in order for the Rangers to not only get back to the playoffs, but get back to the Stanley Cup Finals and maybe even have a shot at winning the Cup this time. Dan Girardi has to be better. He absolutely does. He's losing the faith of many fans, and so he definitely needs to be better this year. Overall, are the New York Rangers a playoff team? No question about it. Despite the losses of guys like Brad Richards, which again was necessary, Brian Boyle, Anton Strawman, Benoit Pouliot, despite the loss of those guys, losing now guys who are now considered Cup final veterans, and guys now considered to have playoff experience, despite those losses, I think the Rangers did a really good job at filling the lost spots, particularly on defense. I think the youngsters that are coming up for them in JT Miller and Jesper Fast, two guys who are going to be on the team full-time this year, I think they'll do a good job at filling in roles as well. And again, I think guys like Lee Stempniak and Tanner Glass and Matthew Lombardi will turn out to be very surprising. I think they'll both be very good surprises. I mean, they're all going to battle for spots in the lineup. I just think the Rangers will have a good season. I think it'll be a good year. Henrik Lundqvist is back, folks. He's back to his traditional form. He's back. He got back into form after the Olympics, and I have no doubt that he's going to stay on that form. And Henrik Lundqvist, I think, will get back to that Vezina Trophy finalist level and being one of the best goaltenders in the world, if not the best goaltender in the world. I think Cam Talbot will have a very good year as a backup. He'll improve from last year. They'll get John Moore signed. They'll get Danny Cristo signed. Danny Cristo, of course, will battle for a spot. If not, if he doesn't make it, he'll play in Hartford and have a very good year there. But their defense, one of the deepest, if not the deepest, in the National Hockey League. I think the addition of Dan Boyle makes it even better. And I actually think Dan Boyle is an upgrade from Anton Strawman, even at his age. So, yes, the New York Rangers are a playoff team. There's no question about it. They are a playoff team, and who knows? They may even have the potential to have a similar type run in the Stanley Cup playoffs and get back to the Stanley Cup Finals. It's a very tough thing to do, and I'm not guaranteeing that they're going to do it, but they have the potential to get back there. They definitely have the potential to get back there. And hey, as far as the regular season goes, I actually think they have a shot at competing for the Metropolitan Division title. I think they have the ability to battle the Pittsburgh Penguins this year for the honor of being the Metropolitan Division leaders. I don't think the Penguins have as good of a roster this year, and I'm going to obviously talk more about that tomorrow because they're the team I'll be doing tomorrow. But I think with what the Penguins lost, they're not a lock for the Metropolitan Division, and the New York Rangers, without question, are the second best team, the next best team to take that position. So yes, the Rangers are a playoff team. They're a potential division winner. It's going to be tough to get back to the Stanley Cup Finals, but even that, I think they have potential to do. And that is it for this extremely long video on the New York Rangers. That is it for episode 139 of Hockey on the Spot. Thank you all for joining me. The Rangers were a team that I really had to talk about. Probably be a very long video for the Los Angeles Kings as well when I get to them and talk about their playoff run. So until then, though, this has been Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. I will see you guys again tomorrow when we talk about the Pittsburgh Penguins. Thank you all and have a great night.